Section 44 of the Treasure Chest of My Book House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Treasure Chest of My Book House. Edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. Princess Nelly and the Seneca Chief. A True Story. In the days of the American Revolution, the whole western Pennsylvania was inhabited by different tribes of Indians. Of these, the Delawares were friends of the whites, and took part with the United States. The Iroquois, on the contrary, were friends and allies of England. Very few white settlers had ventured into those parts at that time, for the life of frontiersmen, amid such roving bands of hostile red men, was one of constant peril and alarm. Even those who felt themselves in some measure protected by their friendly neighbors, the Delawares, never lost sight of the caution required by their exposed position. Only in the vicinity of the military garrison at Pittsburgh, or Fort Pitt, as it was then called, was there any sense of security among the settlers. Here on the banks of the Plum River, a tributary of the Allegheny, there settled one Mr. Little, from Baltimore, with his wife and children. For some time they lived in uneventful comfort, experiencing no hostile visits from the Indians. The neighbors, it is true, having had more experience of frontier life, and being therefore more awake to the cunning and unexpected nature of the savages, had more than once annoyed Mr. Little by false alarms, till he had come to believe the stories of danger entirely exaggerated, visions called up by weak and foolish fear, and he quite relaxed his own vigilance, sinking into an easy-going sense of security. One day in the autumn of 1779 he set out early in the morning with all his serving men to help a neighbor at some distance raise a new building on his farm, thereby leaving his wife and children without a single man to protect them. After the noonday meal, Maggie and Tom, the two younger children, aged 4 and 6 respectively, went out to romp in the garden. Eleanor, or Nelly, the oldest, a pretty child of 9, and her brother, 2 years younger, were at play in a little wooded hollow in the rear of their father's house. Around them lay great trees of the forest, which Mr. Little had recently felled, with branches still untrimmed, and over these they climbed with merry laughter. It was an afternoon of glowing splendor. The meadows swam in golden haze, the hillsides loomed aloft in gold with fleeting purple shadows. The river swept its shining path through banks of flaming autumn color, and over all there seemed to lie a wondrous golden peace. Behind the children in the cabin could be heard the voice of their mother as she sang at her work. No scene could have appeared more homelike and serene. But suddenly Nelly stopped short in the midst of her play and clutched her brother wildly by the shoulder. "Look!" she whispered, "behind that log." The boy peered off in the direction which his sister had indicated. Behind the green and untrimmed boughs of one of those fallen forest giants, what was it moving? A squirrel? A fawn? Or was it a red face? A gaily colored bird, or a clump of colored feathers on the head of a savage Indian? The boy answered not a word. Seizing his sister by the hand, he dragged her off toward the house. The children were accustomed to seeing friendly Delawares about the place. These good Indians now and again made them visits, and some among them the little family held in the warmest affection. But then these came honestly straight to the house. They never came lurking, sneaking, hiding. The sight Nelly and the boy had seen, indistinct though it was, had roused in their minds the memory of all those stories of Indian cruelties with which the neighbors had delighted to regale them. Breathless, the two burst into the cabin. "Mother!" they cried, and the voice of each was more shrill than the other. "Mother, there is a strange Indian down in the hollow, hiding behind the trees." The mother looked quietly up from her knitting, half smiling, half annoyed. "What, only one?" she said. "Usually you fancy a score at least. My dear children, when will you stop alarming us all for nothing? The neighbors' children have frightened you out of your wits with their ridiculous stories. You know quite well our farm is too near Fort Pitt for the Indians to dare give us trouble. If there be any Indians there at all, it is one of our good friends the Delawares. When will you stop mistaking every whisk of a squirrel's tail among the leaves for a band of Indians? Go back to your play and put aside childish fears. Even your little brother and sister out there in the garden have not such childish fancies. You must learn to have greater courage." Nelly and her brother hung their heads, humbled by the rebuke. It is true they had more than once before come running with false alarms, yet now they turned away with lagging feet to obey their mother. This time they felt so sure of what they had seen. The play was all gone out of them. Out past the garden they went where Maggie and Tom were at play. The two little ones giggled and hid as the older ones passed by, making strange and marvelous noises intended to frighten their elders. But Nelly and her brother paid no heed. They went slowly back to the little hollow. A different place it seemed now from what it had been a few moments before. The golden peace had fled. A lurid loneliness brooded about. The shadows had grown fantastic. So very far away, it seemed, from the shelter of the house. Nelly and her brother had no wish to play. They seated themselves on a fallen log and held close to each other. "Hark!" whispered Nelly. "There's a rustling among the bushes." Just at that moment, "Bob White!" a quail whistled somewhere near them. Almost immediately, "Bob White!" a second note answered the first. "It is never birds that are calling like that," said the boy. The children were gazing so intently before them, in the direction of the fallen log where they thought they had seen the red man, that everything else about sank out of their vision entirely. Suddenly big red hands were clapped over their mouths from behind, and they felt themselves seized in an iron grasp. Then two great Indians lifted them from their feet and carried them into the forest. Behind them still faintly sounded, as if from another world, the voice of their mother singing, and the ringing silvery laughter of little Maggie and Tom. At some distance from the house the Indians set the children down to walk by themselves, making grimly threatening gestures to force them to keep silence. Then they hurried off through the forest and soon joined a band of their fellows. So tall and fierce and splendidly dressed were the captors of the children that the little ones guessed at once they must be enemies. They could not possibly be the Delawares of the neighborhood. For some little distance they dragged and drove the children along in silence. The little boy whimpered once. It was a dreadful plight to be in. But then he squared his shoulders, sniffed back his tears, flung back his head, and marched sturdily on his way. As to Nelly, now that the worst had come to pass, her spirit rose undaunted to meet it. There was no more timorousness about her. She took her brother's hand firmly in hers with a motherly air of protection and walked staunchly along by his side, her eyes flashing lightnings if one of the Indians but showed signs of molesting the boy. Neither child had the slightest idea what was about to happen to them, but the overcolored pictures drawn for them by their neighbors made them expect the worst. Through the leafy aisles of the forest on and on they marched. Toward nightfall, as they drew far away from all white settlements, the Indians somewhat relaxed the vigilant guard they had been keeping over the children. When it began to grow dusk they halted, made their camp for the night, lit their campfire, and set their watches to guard against surprise. Then the children were left to their own devices. The two sat down together on the grass at a little distance from their captors, and believing themselves no longer noticed, gave way for the first time to tears. Nelly took her little brother in her arms, and the two wept together at thought of the uncertainty of their fate, of their peaceful home, and the loving mother from whom they had been torn. Suddenly, as they gave vent to their grief, there stood before them a tall and majestic Indian of a strong and forceful countenance, yet strangely mild and gentle. Immovable though his features were, like those of all Indians, he still seemed to feel compassion for the little ones. In his strange Indian tongue, with gutturals and low grunts, he even tried to soothe them. He pulled up great armfuls of the long grass that grew near their camping place and made them a bed. Then he shared with them his own stock of dried meat and parched corn, and gave them to understand by signs that no further evil was intended them. Scarcely had he settled them, somewhat calmed and comforted, on the bed he had prepared, than in the glare of the camp fire there appeared a second party of Indians belonging to the same band. As they loomed up out of the darkness, the light picked out the gaudy colors of their feathers and beads, casting the rest into deep shadow, and shone on their paint-streaked faces and chests with a gleam as of burnished copper. With them they brought a white prisoner. Her pale face, shining almost like marble in contrast to their own, stood out distinctly in the blaze against the black background of the forest. Then the children saw that the prisoner was none other than their mother. With little shrieks of relief they ran and clung to her skirts, and she covered them with kisses. The Indians did not attempt to separate them, but allowed the mother to go off with the children to the couch that had been prepared for them. Then the mother told the little ones how the Indians had fallen upon her while she was at work, all unsuspecting of danger, and had borne her off a prisoner. "And Maggie and Tom in the garden? Where are they? What have they done to them?" sobbed Nelly. The mother bowed her head, her features working in anguish. "I do not know," she whispered, barely commanding her trembling voice. "I do not know where my little ones are, but I hope they escaped with Lizzie." Lizzie was the servant maid. "Lizzie disappeared the moment the Indians came." Then from the depths of her heart, in her hour of terrible doubt and need, the mother called upon Him who is able to save, and felt herself strengthened and comforted. Mrs. Little guessed from their peculiar manner of painting that their captors were Senecas, one of the 6 nations that then formed the tribe of the Iroquois. Doubtless they had left their village with the intention of falling on some band of their enemies, the Delawares, but, failing this, had satisfied themselves by capturing a few white settlers. She devoutly hoped their purpose was to hold the prisoners for ransom, and this seemed most reasonable to suppose, since no violence had been offered them. Early the next morning the savages started once more on their march. It then appeared that the mild and compassionate Indian who had shared his supper with the children the night before was none other than the chief, Corn Planter himself. Day after day they marched, but the prisoners were not ill treated, and Corn Planter seemed to have taken a wonderful fancy to Nelly. Again and again he took her up to ride on his horse before him, offered her some little trinket, or shared with her his food, and at nightfall he never failed to see that a couch of soft grass was prepared for her. On his marked partiality for Nelly, Mrs. Little built bright hopes that he would keep them all in safety, and yield them up soon for ransom. At length the party reached the picturesque little village of the Senecas, nestling mid fragrant dusky pines, tall white oaks, and spreading chestnuts, near the head waters of the Alleghany, at a place now called Olean Point, in southwestern New York. Corn Planter at once took his prisoners to the principal lodge of the village. Herein dwelt his mother, widow of the former chief, a dignified, stately old woman, who was called by the rest the Old Queen. To her Corn Planter said, "Take the white woman and her children and treat them kindly. Many horses and guns will be given to buy them back." But when Mrs. Little and her children had left the lodge, he added, "My mother, I bring to you the little white girl to take the place of the brother who was killed by the Lenape 6 moons ago. She shall be your daughter, to me a sister, and she shall dwell in our lodge forever. The boy and his mother may be bought for a ransom, but little sister shall be ours. Her they shall never have again." So the old Queen took Nelly to her heart in place of the little boy she had lost, and showed her every sign of affection that an Indian can display. Moreover, as her son had commanded, she provided for the prisoners every comfort made possible by the simple manner of life in the village. Thus hope rose still higher in the bosom of Mrs. Little and her children. Alas, they knew not that the very fondness on which they founded their brightest hopes for freedom meant the most serious barrier to any chance of liberation for Nelly. Meantime, late in the evening of the day when Mrs. Little and the children had been captured, the father came whistling home. No lights in the window of the house, within no fire on the hearth, no kettle simmering above with grateful aroma of the evening meal, not a single human being anywhere about. Only the mother's knitting hastily dropped in a chair, and a dilapidated rag doll deserted in a corner. Alarmed beyond measure, the unhappy father hastened off to his nearest neighbor, who lived at a considerable distance. His calls, as he pounded on their door and frantically begged for news, aroused them from their sleep. They had no tidings to give him, but one and all they joined in the search for the missing ones. At length, in the house of another neighbor, they found the servant maid. Between many tears she managed to tell Mr. Little how the Indians had descended upon the house. At the first alarm, she said, she had run to an outer kitchen and hidden under a large brewing tub. There she had remained until the departure of the Indians, when she fled at once to a place of safety. All she knew concerning the family was that her mistress had been carried off, and doubtless the children too, but that, so far as she had observed, no violence had been offered them. The father and his neighbors then continued the whole night long to scour the neighborhood, searching everywhere about. Towards morning Mr. Little remembered an old settler who lived all alone far up in the valley. To his cabin he and his friends immediately went, and from him they learned that, as he was at work in his field just before sunset, he had observed a party of strange Indians passing at some distance from him. As they wound along the brow of the hill, their forms clearly silhouetted against the sky, he could see that they had with them a prisoner who was a white woman. Here the miserable father felt sure was news of his wife at last, and he determined to go at once with his friends to Fort Pitt to ask advice and assistance of the commandant and Indian agent there. Accordingly they proceeded down the valley just as the sun was rising. On their way they came suddenly upon a hut which they had searched the night before and found apparently deserted. To their surprise they now saw standing on the high bank before it a little boy and girl holding fast to each other's hands. Mr. Little at once recognized his two youngest children, Maggie and Tom, and in another moment they were fast in his arms and pouring out their tale in his ears. "We were in the garden, father," cried the boy, "when the Indians came, so many Indians, into the yard right by the house. And den," sobbed the little girl, "Tommy he pulled me over the fence and we hided ourselves in the bushes and runned so far. And where's my mother? I want my mother." It appeared that the boy, who was only 6 years of age, had indeed shown the most remarkable courage, devotion, and intelligence in saving himself and his sister from the red men. He had on the very first alarm half pulled and half pushed the little girl over the fence into a neighboring field, overrun with blackberry bushes and wild raspberry. Here they hid themselves, having the sense and self-command to make no outcry at all until all was quiet and no Indians in sight, when they attempted to force a way through the field in the direction opposite to the house. Unfortunately the little girl in her play in the garden had pulled off her shoes and stockings, and the ground being very rough, uneven, and covered with briars, she soon found her feet so cut and bruised that she sank to the ground and declared she could not go a single step further. Then the boy took off his own stockings, put them on her feet, and gave her also his shoes, himself going barefoot over the torturing ground. The little creature obediently tried to scuffle along in the shoes so many sizes too large, but they kept slipping off altogether, so she could not possibly wear them. Then the boy took back the shoes, but he stuck faithfully by his sister, patiently coaxing and encouraging her on, lifting her over the roughest spots, and part of the time half carrying her. Thus they made their way at length out of the field and into an enclosed pasture ground. Here, to their great delight, they saw some cows securely and peacefully feeding. These cows, as they knew, belonged to an old woman named Granny Myers, who lived some little distance away. But in what direction from the pasture her cottage lay they had not the slightest idea. With a wisdom that might have done credit to a grown man, the boy said, "Let's hide ourselves until sunset, when the cows will go home and we can follow them." Accordingly, this was what the children did. But when they reached Granny Myers' hut, in the wake of the lowing cattle, what was their dismay to find the house close locked and deserted. The old woman had been called by some business down the valley and did not return that night. Tired and hungry, Maggie and Tom could go no further. With much effort they managed to get a few drops of milk from the cows, then laid themselves down to sleep under an old bedstead that stood behind the house. When their father and his searching party approached the place during the night, they had occasioned fresh terror in the children, who mistook the shouts and calls by means of which the searchers sought to arouse the inmates of the house for the whoop of the Indians, and, far from revealing themselves, they had crept closer together and kept as far out of sight as possible. When found in the morning, they were debating what step to take next in order to reach safety. Mr. Little, having then placed his two youngest children in security at Fort Pitt, told his tale to the commandant there, who was readily interested in the matter, and furnished the father with a detachment of soldiers to aid in the search. Circumstances soon pointed to the Senecas as the probable marauders, and the relief party at once directed their search among the villages of the tribe. It was necessary, however, to make their inquiries with the greatest caution, for all the tribes of the Iroquois, being allies of Great Britain, were decidedly hostile to the Americans. Thus a long time passed before the father reached the village of Corn Planter, on the head waters of the Alleghany. What was his unspeakable joy to find here his wife and the two older children. At once he began to enter into negotiations with Corn Planter for ransoming his family. Mrs. Little and the boy. Yes, Corn Planter readily agreed to a price for them and set them free at once. But Nelly? No, never. She was the adopted child of the tribe. She was his sister. He had taken her to supply to his mother the place of the little brother who was gone. She was dear to him and he would not part with her. To every entreaty of the father and mother, even of Nelly herself, to every increase in the price offered for the child, Corn Planter only grunted, "Oh, oh," and shook his head with decision. At length, finding every effort useless, the father was compelled to take his sorrowful departure, and set out once more for home with such of his loved ones as he had been fortunate enough to recover. Little Nelly threw herself into the arms of her father and mother, almost in despair, as they bade each other a last farewell, and the hearts of all were heavy with grief. But there was nothing else to be done, and the mother could only commend the child with a simple faith, which was all that could possibly give her comfort in such an hour of trial, to the tender mercy and care of the Father of all. Then Mr. and Mrs. Little and their son set out on their melancholy journey homeward, trusting that some future attempt would be more effectual in recovering their daughter. Never for a moment did Mr. Little relax his efforts in Nelly's behalf. He left his family in Pittsburgh, and then, hoping that a British officer, a representative of a country that was the friend and ally of the Iroquois, might have more influence with Corn Planter than those who were regarded as enemies, he undertook an expedition to the Canadian frontier, a long and dangerous enough journey in those days, hoping to gain the assistance of the British Indian agent, Colonel Johnson. His story of what had occurred warmly interested the feelings of that benevolent officer. In spite of the fact that the United States and Great Britain were at war, Colonel Johnson saw in the grief-stricken father no enemy, but a fellow man commanding his sympathy on the grounds of their common humanity. He therefore promised to spare no exertions in attempting to recover little Nelly. This promise he faithfully fulfilled. As soon as the opening of the spring made a journey possible, he went in person to the village of Corn Planter, and made him a most splendid offer of guns and horses if he would release the child. But Corn Planter was inexorable. He answered the British agent as he had answered the Americans, with nothing more than two grunts and a most decisive shake of his head. So slowly the months lengthened out into years, and still Princess Nelly dwelt in the lodge of the old queen, the beloved of the chief corn planter and his mother and all the tribe. Nothing could exceed the consideration and affection with which she was treated by all. The principal seat in the lodge was reserved for her. The most delicate food was invariably saved for her. All the handsomest silver brooches and strings of wampum were used to make fine her garments. No efforts were spared to make her happy and cause her to forget her former home and dear ones. For a long time Nelly resisted any attempts at consolation, crying out continually for her mother, but at length, as the kindness of the Indians remained unfailing, she grew somewhat more reconciled to her lot, and even happy in the great affection which Corn Planter showered upon her. More and more love for his little sister wound itself around the big chief's heart. More and more his tenderness for her became a part of his very being. As he followed the game in the woods, as he led his band of warriors through the pathless depths of the forest, thoughts of the little sister awaiting him by the hearth of his mother's lodge shed a greater warmth into his life than the very warmth of the sun itself. Nelly being by nature affectionate, the unbounded tenderness of those among whom she dwelt called forth a certain response in her heart. Though she could never cease longing for her own dear mother, she grew to regard Corn Planter and the old queen with remarkable love and reverence. She learned to speak their language, and even found much joy in sharing the bustling life of the village. Wherever she went about, whether gathering wild rice from the river in her little birch bark canoe, hoeing the corn in the cornfield, or playing at ball or bowl, she always displayed such ceaseless activity and unbounded energy that the Indians gave her the name of the "Ship under full sail," and by that poetic title they always called her. Thus 4 years passed. 4 times the months rolled their slow round from the moon of leaves to the moon of snowshoes, from the moon of snowshoes to the moon of leaves, while Nelly dwelt in the little village on the bank of the Alleghany. Then in 1783 came the peace between the United States and Great Britain, which ended the War of the Revolution. In consequence, a general pacification of the Indian tribes took place, and fresh hopes of recovering their daughter arose in the hearts of Mr. and Mrs. Little. They removed with their family to Fort Niagara, near which was the great council fire of the Senecas, whither once every year came the sachems and chiefs from the various Seneca villages to decide the weighty affairs of the nation. The kindly Colonel Johnson really undertook fresh negotiations with Corn Planter, and in order to make sure of success, he again proceeded in person to the village at Olean Point. His visit occurred at the most propitious of seasons, for the Indians were celebrating the festival of the corn when he arrived among them. It was the one season of all the year most remarkable for general joy and happiness. Gaily was the village decked with golden ears of corn and glowing autumn leaves, while here and there rose arbors of fresh green boughs. Men, women, and children, in gala dress, were living out of doors. Young men and dusky maidens stripped the husks from off the ears with merry laughter. Here some played games of ball, tossing little balls of deerskin. There gaily painted warriors in the brightest gala garments gathered in a dance to the tom tom of the drum and the shrieking of the rattle, while the squaws kept time with awkward movements on the edge of the circle. Beneath the fragrant pine trees old men squatted looking on, smoking their pipes in solemn silence, and now and then grunting approval. In the merry village Colonel Johnson was received with all consideration, as was due to his position and long friendship with the tribe. When he spoke of little Nelly she was summoned in to meet him, and it appeared at once that nothing had been spared to make her garments splendid. A petticoat of blue broadcloth she wore, bordered with gay colored ribbons, a sack of black silk ornamented with 3 rows of silver brooches. Around her neck were strings and strings of purple wampum. Her hair was clubbed behind and loaded with beads. Her leggins were of scarlet cloth, her moccasins of deerskin embroidered with porcupine quills. all the love that had been showered upon the child were evidenced in her garments. Nevertheless, when she had withdrawn, Colonel Johnson, observing that the joyous festival had warmed and opened the hearts of all, ventured to tell Corn Planter how the mother and father of his little sister had given up their house and friends and come hundreds of miles to settle in the strange land on the bare hope of sometimes looking on their loved one, or even perhaps of embracing her. Then at last the heart of the chief was softened. There was soon to be held at Fort Niagara, on the British side of the river, the grand council of the Senecas, and thither Corn Planter promised to come, bringing his sister with him, that her parents might just have a glimpse of her. But he exacted a most solemn promise from Colonel Johnson that no effort should be made to reclaim the child, and even that no proposal should be made to him to part with her. Accordingly, in due time, Chief Corn Planter set out, with Princess Nelly on horseback beside him, her heart beating with joy at the thought of seeing her mother. Nelly had promised the chief that she would never leave him without his permission, and he had perfect faith in her word. Meanwhile, as the chiefs and warriors arrived in successive bands at the fort, the anxious parents watched longingly for a first sight of their daughter. At length the party was discerned emerging from the forest on the American side of the river, and Mr. and Mrs. Lytle could see at a glance that the little captive was with them. Surrounded by all the officers and ladies of the fort, they stood on the grassy bank, scarcely able to contain themselves for longing impatience. Boats were sent across by the commanding officer to fetch Corn Planter and his party, but when they arrived the chief alone entered one of them with his little sister. To his young men he said, "Stand here with the horses and wait until I return." He held his darling close by the hand until the river was passed, until the boat touched the bank. Then the child, no longer to be restrained, rushed forward into her mother's arms, and the two began hugging and kissing each other as though they had been fairly famished with longing. When he beheld that sight, the great chief could withstand no longer. He spoke no word, but made an eloquent gesture of surrender. Then he turned and ordered the oarsmen to row him back alone to the further bank. All the way over the river he stood in the stern of the boat, looking back with folded arms for a farewell glimpse of his loved one, majestic, almost heroic, a noble statue in bronze, savage though he was, of sublime renunciation. No arguments nor entreaties could induce him to remain at the council. Having gained the opposite side of the river, he called his braves about him and made off into the forest. Mr. Lytle could scarcely believe that Corn Planter's relinquishment of Nelly was really permanent. Dreading lest he should change his mind after a few weeks and again take steps to recover her, the father determined to change his place of abode once more. In compliance with the decision, he crossed Lake Erie with his family and settled in the neighborhood of Detroit, where he continued to live thereafter. And so it came about that little Nelly saw her good friend, the chief, no more, but she never forgot him. Throughout all her life there remained in her heart a tender memory of the strong and forceful warrior who had been to her as gentle as a woman. Section 44.